Hi, we continue in Luke 8 today with a new story, the interwoven healing stories of the 12-year-old daughter of the temple official Jairus and the healing of the woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. And in these two stories, we're going to see an alternative response to what failed in the previous scene, where Jesus and Gerasa tried to trigger a non-violent revolt against the Romans that would unite the urban elite who would be inclined to side with the Romans, or at least get economic benefit with them, from people represented by the swineherds representing the oppressed class underneath Roman rule, to try to get them to come together once Legion was expelled. But they were afraid and they didn't do it, and Jesus left the healed man there to evangelize them and returns to the other side. And as we'll see in this story, the contrast between the high-status daughter of the synagogue official and the low status of the woman who's spent all her money on physicians who failed to heal her accomplishes, at least symbolically, the bonding of the elite and the poor as equals that we would have seen if the revolt had taken place in Gerasa. And whether there's any response to it here, we'll have to see from the disciples as we go. So, as we've been doing, you can see on the right side of the screen the comparison with Luke's source, Mark, and then with Matthew on the right side. And as we can see here, as with the previous scene, Mark, whose gospel is much shorter, only 16 chapters, and Luke is 24 and Matthew's 28, but Mark has a lot more detail of this story, just as he did in the previous story, than Luke does. These were very important stories for Mark, as Ched Myers pointed out many years ago in Binding the Strong Man, a work that has certainly influenced me greatly, not only on Mark, but on reading the New Testament in general. If you don't know it, I encourage you to read it. But Luke has deleted some things and added some things, as we saw in the previous scene, and so we're going to focus on the parts that are bold here that Luke adds, that he incorporates into the parts that are not bold that he takes from Mark. And as we do, there are a number of important details to pay attention to. For example, who is this bleeding woman? There are many theories on it, and to include some of the recent scholarship, I'd just like to show us four of the sources I'm going to be including here, and just the sort of primary themes that they name, and we'll see how it works out when we look at the details. One here, very recently from 2021, from Sarah Harris, and you see her picture there, from New Zealand, The Bleeding Woman, A Journey from the Fringes. And she makes a point of saying, against our earlier readings that suggested the Jewish law was imposing upon her, and the good thing she got liberated by Christianity, Jesus who liberated people from the Jewish law, she points out the anti-Semitism in that, and not only that, she highlights the misogyny that is implicit in assuming the Jewish law made women sit on the margins and that she was not be allowed to be out in public. And she highlights in great detail how that's simply a Christian misreading of Leviticus. So we'll use her work as we go. But from a different perspective here, and David Shaw, whose work we see, he's from South Africa and Australia, Restoring a Hemorrhage Identity, the identity and impact of the bleeding woman, he suggests she may be a Gentile. And we'll look at that as well, too. She's not named daughter of Abraham, like the woman in chapter 13 who's bent over, who Jesus says Satan held bound for all those years, daughter of Abraham. So it's ambiguous, and so we'll look at the question of, might she not be a Jew at all? We'll also look here at Robert Stegman and Nadine Bowers de Toits, and they're writing from South Africa, and their article is titled A Textured Reading of Well-Being, an Interdisciplinary Consideration of Luke 8:40-56. And as you can see from the highlighted part, they engage both socio-rhetorical methodology and social scientific approaches to reimagine what well-being might mean in the sense of the Hebrew shalom, and how she is not only cured, but she's saved. So we'll look at that. And then finally hear from Shelley Rambo, Trauma and Faith, reading the narrative of the hemorrhage woman from 2009, the oldest of our quartet. And she does a lot from her own work on trauma to ask the question of how this woman who's been completely traumatized by bleeding and then losing all her resources to incompetent physicians, healers, now dares to bring her faith to Jesus. So finally, as we begin this, I just want to highlight some key words in this section. I broke it into these three paragraphs. This story is casually called a sandwich, more formally called an intercalation, where this story is placed in between these other two stories. Although Luke makes it much more of continuous one story than Mark does, and we'll see some of those differences as we go. But you can see a couple of the key words. Obviously the sense of daughter, that they're both called daughters and equalized, and they both have to do with 12 years, as we can see here. 12 and 12. Mark keeps the 12 of the daughter till the end as a surprise, but Luke presents that right at the beginning, so we know that right away. And we see touch 4 times in there, and as many scholars have noted, and this is clearly a question of embodiment. There's no sense of salvation here that isn't embodiment, as power goes out from Jesus, but Jesus doesn't know where it went. And then as they return to the question of Jairus and his daughter, we see the daughter again and the question of salvation connecting here, which also connects both to the previous scene with the Gerasene and other scenes where Jesus said, "Your faith has saved you," as in the woman who anoints Jesus' feet in the house of Simon the Pharisee in chapter 7. So those are some of the things we're going to look at as we go. So let's jump right into our story. So as we begin in verse 40, we hear where the narrator tells us when Jesus returned, but it doesn't say to return where. So let's look at the map for a second and recall that the previous scene, although the Decapolis is mentioned here and Gerasa is not, Gerasa was down here somewhere, but we were talking about the countryside, the whole region, and since the pigs went down into the lake, they had to be somewhere over here. But they could have gone back anywhere. They could have gone to Tiberias or Magdala or any of these places, Bethsaida. But the previous mentioned place in 7:1 was Capernaum. So since it says they returned rather than going someplace new, I think it's reasonable to assume that where they went was back to Capernaum, which evokes the fact that in Capernaum, Jesus encountered a centurion who had a pais, either a son or a servant or a partner, as we looked at there, who was ill. And so the synagogue leader is very parallel to him, as we'll see. And so he returns presumably to Capernaum, and the crowd welcomed him here. And it's a diametric contrast with what happened in Gerasa, where we heard that the man met him, but we noted there that the word for met was like a military confrontation, one army up against another army. This is the exact opposite. This is a word for welcoming, and they're all waiting for him, so he gets this positive entrance here. And we see both elsewhere in Luke, we'll see later in 9:11, but also a number of times in Acts, this is always used with a positive connotation. So the crowd here in Capernaum, assuming it's Capernaum, are welcoming, and they're all waiting for him. We're not sure exactly what they're waiting for, but they're waiting for him. And then the narrator jumps in with the kai idu, which is the dramatic, and behold, not just this then, but behold, there came a man named Jairus, a leader of the synagogue. And we already see that it's shifted from Mark here. Mark said the great crowd gathered around him and he was by the sea, and one of the leaders came. We don't know they're by the sea here. We don't know exactly where they are. Again, I'm assuming it's Capernaum. And here, Jairus speaks and names something very specific. He fell at Jesus' feet, as we see in Luke, and begged him, and we see that in Luke. But then he adds repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So we hear him repeatedly begging him and the desperation there. Whereas in Luke, we just simply hear he fell at Jesus' feet and begged him to come to his house. And it's only after that that we're told that he has a daughter who is dying. But it's all done by the narrator instead of live, and which makes it a little less personal. So Jairus here doesn't have the pathos in listeners as he would have in Mark, when we can hear him begging with the dying daughter and falling at Jesus' feet. The name Jairus is unique in the New Testament, unique in the Bible, but certainly from the Hebrew ger, as you can see in the note before, referred to a number of times, from the Hebrew root or, meaning to give light. So there may be some irony in his name there. He's described as a leader of the synagogue, an archon, in contrast to what Mark calls him, an arche-synagogus, which he'll be called later in Luke. But here the archon, some scholars suggest it's simpler, or maybe Luke's audience wouldn't be familiar with that term. Maybe that's the case. I'm not sure why Mark's audience would have been any more familiar with it than Luke's. But he's still described as a leader of the synagogue. But when this happens, we realize there's something very interesting happening here. And I'll put this up before we get to the other story. Justice, I'd like to suggest it's a parallel with what we see in the Gospel of John with Nicodemus, also an archon of the synagogue in Jerusalem, and the Samaritan woman. They're not the same stories, of course. Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night, and it's a very different context. There's no sense that he has a child or a daughter at all there. And the Samaritan woman is a Samaritan, so she's not a Judean or a Galilean, and she's certainly not a Gentile, and Jesus goes to her place. So these stories are not the same, but they're certainly parallel with a high-status Jewish man and a low-status woman of a different cultural context who were made equal through the encounter with Jesus. Since John's Gospel doesn't seem to have synoptic connections, perhaps there's some deep root here that connects this pair of stories in the synoptics with that pair in John. But that's pure speculation. But it's to highlight that there are parallels, even if the stories aren't directly related, in the theology of Jesus being about equalizing high-status people and low-status people, as well as equalizing men and women against the patriarchy of the time. So back to our immediate story, Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, fell at Jesus' feet, and being at Jesus' feet here equates him with the woman who anoints Jesus' feet in the house of Simon the Pharisee, a woman who is described as a sinner, and certainly, according to Simon, if Jesus had known what sort of woman she was, he wouldn't have dealt with her. But this is the exact opposite kind of a man, a man of great local status. Scholars have argued about whether he's a patron, like the centurion, or just a local official of someone in charge of the ritual at the synagogue. We really don't know that much about how synagogues worked in the first century. But he certainly seems to be somebody important who isn't afraid to come up to Jesus. But he lowers his status by falling at his feet. The begging would suggest he's lowering his status too, but the word parakalai simply means to invite or call alongside. So it doesn't necessarily have the implication of begging in the sense of lowering yourself, although he's already literally lowered himself to be at Jesus' feet. So he recognizes Jesus' status and says to come to his house. But he doesn't say to heal my daughter. There's nothing about that. There's none of the pathos that we saw otherwise. Luke adds this come to the house, and that perhaps echoes that Jesus sent the person healed of the demon in the last scene back to his house. And now the narrator tells us, for he had, and that suggests perhaps no wife or mother, that they had, or he and his wife, although we will see a little later, it says the child's mother is invited into the scene. So at the moment, it suggests parallel to the widow of Nain, and in fact, that's connected further by the word for only daughter, monogenes, thugatra monogenes, which matches 7:12, only son. So here's a man with an only daughter, and there's a woman with an only son. And at least initially, we see just him, and we can envision his daughter. But again, in a few verses, we'll hear that the mother is there as well. And the fact that we hear that she's 12 years old now tells us everything we didn't know. Again, Mark, we see, didn't put the 12 years old till down here, but Luke tells us right at the beginning. And of course, 12 years old nowadays for a Jewish girl would be a time of bat mitzvah, at the time she becomes a daughter of the commandments, and that's parallel to a boy's bar mitzvah at 13, suggesting it's a time of her puberty, the time she begins her menstruation and becomes a woman. And so we see that her problem is she may be dying before she begins to bleed, and the other one may be dying because she's bleeding. So the opposite end of what 12 is. For the 12 years of this little girl's life, this other woman has been bleeding. And we're told explicitly here she's dying, that the daughter is dying. And so as he went, and it's assumed to be Jesus who goes, although they are all going, presumably, Jairus is going too, but Jesus doesn't say a word. There's nothing mentioned. It's really a very low-key introduction because the focus is now going to be on what follows. So let's look at just at least the beginning of this story here, and as we go through it, we'll look at the work of the scholars I've noted to see both what evidence of her ethnicity there might be and also of her status. So now here is simply kai and, so it's one continuous sentence here. There's really no break at all. As he went, the crowds pressed in on him, and there was a woman who had been suffering hemorrhages. So there she is right in the middle of the crowd here. Shaw argues here that she could be a Gentile, countering the standard assumption based on Jewish purity. He notes in 5:14, Jesus' healing of the leper includes, go show yourself to the priest, in accordance with Leviticus 14:2-32, but there's no such call here in accordance with Leviticus 15:25-31. And so that's the first of a number of pieces of evidence to suggest that she might not be a Jew at all. But here she is. There's no word for suffering here, simply she is in a flow of blood. And Harris highlights that flow of blood can have different opinions based on Roman views or Jewish views. In the Jewish view, if we see her as Jewish here, would not render her unclean or make her unable to go in public. What it would make unclean, according to a good reading of Leviticus, is the clothes she wears when she's bleeding and her bed that she bleeds into. In other words, it's the objects touched by the blood that are rendered unclean. But she personally is not rendered unclean. So any assumption that she shouldn't be in public or out touching Jesus is just based on either misunderstanding or Christian prejudice that the Jewish law is restrictive in a way that it was not. So she is suffering from this bleeding, and we're told she'd spent all she had on healers, but no one could cure her. The word here, prosenolosasa, is only here in the Bible. Bios, which is the root for life in a sense, in contrast with zoe, the quality of life, bios being the quantitative elements of life, biology. But it also means substance, what one has. So Everything she has, she's been spent on healers. Physicians is over translating as if they'd gone to medical school. Healers could be of many varieties. Local people with herbs and women with herbs, or it could be people trained in the Greek medical tradition such as it was. The Hippocratic Oath still remains for doctors today, grounded in Greek ancient medical tradition. But no one was strong enough to heal her. The phrase ukeshusen here is a number of times for highlighting strong enough. It's not. We don't really think of this as being a matter of strength, but it's a key theme, and we'll look at it more as we go, including in chapter 13 and elsewhere, where people are not strong enough to cure her. Therapeuo here. And notice the end, just like with the Gerasene demoniac, will not be just to cure her, but to save her, to restore her to the condition that she's intended to be in by God. And so Luke omits her internal monologue here, where she'd been thinking, if I but touch his clothes, I will be made well. So we don't get inside her thoughts any more than we heard the synagogue official's thoughts. But she comes up behind him and touched the fringe of his clothes. And the word for touch, as we saw, is a key word here, and fringe is important. Notice Luke did not have, or Mark did not have that. Mark had touched his cloak, and it touched his clothes, but this has touched the fringe of his clothes. And again, as Harris notes, that connects us to Numbers, where touching the fringe suggests a priestly act, as we see from my note down here. As Harris notes, as she took hold of the ritual fringes, she demonstrated she knew what they represented, the commandments of the law from Numbers 15:38 to 41. In this act, our woman functioned as a priest who took hold of the horns of the altar with both hands in blood rituals, and in doing so made a plea for God's mercy. And we see only two other references to the fringe in Deuteronomy and Zechariah, highlighting that that's meant to be a symbol of the commandments. So that would suggest a Jewish consciousness, at least. Why would a Gentile want to touch the fringe specifically of his clothes? And we hear immediately her hemorrhage stopped. Perikrima, as opposed to euthos, which is Mark's common word for immediately, her hemorrhage, and there's an unusual word, histemi, which has a range of meanings that don't necessarily suggest stopping, but established. And so, in other words, the bleeding was established as ended there. Notice that Luke omits she felt in her body that she was healed from Mark. Let's just look briefly at a couple of images here that give us the immediacy of this. So this one I like from Tissot because it shows the crowd, and we'll see that in the next scene we'll look at next video, where Jesus can't figure out who touched him, given that everybody seems to be touching him. And this one I just love from the Chapel of Mary Magdalene in Magdala, where we see up close to the feet, touching at the feet. And then this one also from an unnamed artist reaching out for the fringe. So in all these we see the desperation of a woman for whom the system has failed, who comes up and believes that Jesus can be the one to save her. And how these two daughters will both be saved, we'll begin to see in our next scene. See you then. Bye-bye.